Hey, it's Andy here. Before we get to the show today, I just wanted to give you a heads up. We're going to do a two-part series with University of Chicago's Will Cong. We're going to do a deep dive into his papers on blockchain, smart contracts, and cryptocurrencies, as well as discuss his recent travels around the world over the summer to more than 10 different conferences in 4 continents on technology and blockchain. The goal is to get a deeper understanding of not only his research, but also to find out what he learned on these topics from the travels that he had and the conferences that he attended. Please enjoy part 1 of my interview with the University of Chicago's Will Cong. Welcome to CFTC Talks. I'm your host, Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. As always, there's a disclaimer at the end of the show that's important for you to listen to. Hey, over the last course of the year on the show, we covered a wide range of technology issues. We spoke with Alex Rampell from Andreessen Horowitz on fintech and blockchain. We had on Coin Center's Peter Van Valkenburg to discuss digital currencies. And of course, we did our Bitcoin CFTC self-certification roundtable. Those are all great information, and all shows, if you get a chance, go back and listen to them and check them out. So today, we continue in this tradition and bring on someone who took a different angle to understanding blockchain and came up with some fascinating insights. Will Cong is an assistant professor of finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. With several co-authors, they wrote the NBER working paper, Tokenomics, Dynamic Adoption and Valuation, as well as Blockchain Disruption and Smart Contracts. That is a forthcoming review. I think that's forthcoming in a review of financial studies. Professor Cong, welcome to CFTC Talks.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to join you for the conversation.
I'm looking forward to it so much, especially hearing about your travels. But ladies and gentlemen, before we get to all of the fun stuff, just a bit of background on our guest today, because it's really pretty impressive. Now, he currently is an assistant professor of finance and a PhD advisor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and a faculty member at the Center for East Asia Studies. Formerly, he was a doctoral student at the Stanford Institute for Innovation in Developing Economies, a George Schultz Scholar at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and is currently a Kaufman Jr. Faculty Fellow. Now, he advises fintech and investment firms and organizations like the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance and is a member of multiple professional organizations such as the American Economic Association, European Finance Association, and the Econometric Society. Now, Will researches on financial economics, information economics, and entrepreneurial finance and fintech. And he started studying blockchain in 2013 while being a doctoral student at Stanford, and he advised String Lab, in case anybody knows who that is, the incubator of Definity, and helped get it its first venture investment. Just an FYI, everybody, the company just received $61 million in funding from Andreessen Horowitz this year, so they're off to a great start. Will, it's great to have you on to discuss your research and recent travels.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, it's way better than mine. My background is a lot more interesting. But let's begin with the paper and get to some definitions going forward to really help level set everybody before we get to the fun stuff. I mean, by now, many are familiar with Bitcoin and many other cryptocurrencies, but not as many are familiar with the open source code behind it and the use of blockchain to create a core functionality known as Decentralized Consensus. So we'll start us off, talk about Decentralized Consensus and why it's key for blockchain.
Definitely. As you correctly point out, there's a lot of attention devoted to Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies or even blockchain. And, as far as I could read from many articles and news reports, there's a gazillion names and concepts given to the technology.
Right.
In my research, what I really try to do is to kind of strip it down to the essence. For example, anonymity is a feature of Bitcoin, but it's not the defining feature of blockchain. It's something that people can design. So what blockchain really is that it provides us what I call decentralized consensus. Now, the concept of consensus is not alien to many of us. I used to say to my friends, consensus makes the world go around. For societies to function, for economies to function. It's typically or traditionally provided by centralized parties, such as governments, judges or courts, or even third-party business arbitrators when there is a business conflict or dispute. Now, what the blockchain technology brings in is the possibility of providing a consensus in a decentralized way. I have to qualify this statement in the sense that many so-called public blockchains, such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, they are providing or trying to provide this decentralized consensus. Many consortium blockchains, such as R3CEV or Repo, which is for international payments and remittance, those are alliances of major financial institutions. They are not fully decentralized, but more decentralized than what it used to be. Mm-hmm. But there are also the concept of private blockchains, which is, to me, a kind of a database upgrade. It's going to save costs. It's going to be useful, but it's not the key innovation in that sense.
Right.
One question one might ask is, why do we want it to be decentralized? I mean, the societies have been functioning okay for centuries in a centralized manner.
Right.
So the key benefit.
What's the advantage of doing decentralized consensus?
Exactly. The key benefits that the advocates of the technology typically mention are two. Number one is, with a decentralized consensus system, we can potentially prevent single points of failure. What do I mean by that? Well, think about Filecoin, for example. That's a platform for people to store their files in a decentralized manner, a little bit similar to Box or Dropbox. If we use Box or Dropbox, the hard disks are stored in centralized locations by the company. And if there is a natural disaster or some unforeseen circumstances, it's possible that the whole system is wiped out, all our storage is lost, so on and so forth. Whereas if we do it in a decentralized way, with duplications of nodes and data, we don't worry about one single computer's or one single region's failure making the whole system collapse. So that's number one. Number two, because it's decentralized and often open to new entries of competition, it reduces the rent that traditional intermediaries charge, which could be beneficial to consumers. But we have to be cautious there, because the intermediary rent is what economists would call a endogenous variable. So it could go either way. It could be useful in incentivizing innovations as well. But those are the two typical kind of benefits. Now, taking a step back, what the system or the technology is really trying to provide, I call it decentralized consensus, but what it really is providing is a functional trust system, right? And the technology holds the promise to achieve it with at least three desirable features. One is decentralization. We'll talk about the benefits of that. Second is consensus. We can reach agreement on what has happened and how we are going to conduct our business activities. And the third one, which is also what many practitioners are working on, is a feature of scalability. If we think about Bitcoin, for example, it does solve the first two. It provides decentralization and consensus. Consensus is by itself is not new. Systems like Paxos or even the kind of coding, program coding in Google, for example, allows people to reach consensus. We can piece together the codes programmers perform separately and reach a consensus output. But typically, the actors in that system are machines. We don't think about incentive issues too much.
Right.
Digital cash is not a innovation either. By digital cash, I mean P2P, kind of direct value transfer systems. It's not new either. There were similar concepts in the 90s or early 2000s. It achieves decentralization, but it does not really achieve consensus all the time. And that leads to issues of double spending many people are familiar with, because we don't always have a consensus that A has spent $10 or 10 tokens to B. Therefore, A can now spend the same 10 tokens to person C.
Right.
So the Bitcoin or Nakamoto's innovation really lies in kind of using the digital tokens or digital currency, cryptocurrency, to provide incentives to maintain this consensus. But that said, it is still hard to have all three desirable features because Bitcoin, for example, does not achieve scalability compared to Visa, MasterCard. Mm-hmm. It just cannot process transactions in a high speed. So it's a little bit like a trilemma, akin to the monetary trilemma. Sometimes it's called impossibility trinity. That free capital flow, fixed exchange rate, and sovereign monetary policy cannot be achieved at the same time. Here, to achieve three features has been challenging. When you have decentralization and consensus, you lose scalability, but people have not given up yet. So many, practitioners are working on kind of layer one consensus protocol innovation or layer two cross-chain, off-chain architectures to help increase or achieve this scalability in addition to, the decentralized consensus part.
Right. And I know I laugh because there's so much money being tossed at this. I laugh. Right. Of course, people are they're still trying to do all of this. But I'm just kind of laughing at myself. I'm just thinking of the billions of dollars that are going into this field. I guess what is so captivating to me in your research is in the paper, Blockchain Disruption and Smart Contracts, or one of your many papers, I should say, you state that blockchain applications typically feature a fundamental tension between what we just discussed, this decentralized consensus, and information distribution. And the former, the consensus, enhances contractability and is welfare improving. That's what we want as a society. But the latter, the information distribution, could be detrimental to society. That was really interesting to me. Will, many who advocate the use of blockchain technology offer up the enhanced contractability and welfare improving and reduction in paperwork component, but very few discuss the detriment to society and what that could be. So break this down for us. Discuss first this tension between decentralized consensus and the information distribution. What's the problem here?
Sure. I'm glad to touch on these points more. So if we want to figure out the kind of the tensions there or the costs of providing decentralized consensus, we have to understand how it is actually generated. The way blockchain works, at least in many instances, is that to record some transactions or, let's say, smart contracts or business agreements, the system has to contact what I call record keepers. In the case of Bitcoin, that would be the miners, right, who are mining to make make record of transactions in the next block. So, that's in the consensus generation stage. And even after it's generated, the way it is maintained is through distributing the consensus records to various nodes. So there's a lot of duplication, right, at least for public blockchains. So there is a tension in terms of information distribution in the following sense. If I want to achieve decentralized consensus, that means I have to contact more record keepers to enjoy those two benefits of decentralized consensus that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
That means I have to distribute information to more verifiers or record keepers. Mm-hmm. Computer scientists might argue, while we do have what's called zero-knowledge proof or zero-knowledge protocols, where through encryption, we don't have to truly reveal the information, but at the same time verify it. That would solve some problem, but to an economist, even encrypted information is information, right? When someone is being contacted, that's already conveying some information.
Right.
Moreover, if we encrypt some information, that limits the extent that we can verify the details of business transactions. And that's something many central banks have realized. For example, Bank of Canada in their Jasper project found that more robust data verification necessarily requires wider sharing of information. And there's a delicate balance between transparency and privacy in that setting. Such a system may have problems when the information distribution is called into question.
Well, I guess the thing that stands out to me, what's interesting, is that you're talking about sharing information and distributing that out to everybody in the block. And that gives everybody, to some extent, like perfect information, or at least, as you said, it signals something that there's a transaction going on. And a lot of times you wouldn't even know that. And what I liked about the paper is I think you ran through like a real estate agent's example where sometimes they would lose business and not have any idea why. But if it was all on a blockchain, not only could they tell that where they were losing business, or if they were losing business at all, but also at the price at which people were moving around and going to other people, that might give them an advantage somehow. And this leads to perhaps some thinking amongst those people within the blockchain that they could get together and influence that.
Right. So I think you actually touch on a very interesting, a little bit puzzling aspect of information distribution. Wouldn't distributing more information be beneficial to the society? Well, in some cases, yes, but in many other cases, it could have detrimental effects. For example, certain transactions or trades in the financial markets should not be released immediately because other people can free ride on the information or copycat the trading strategy. In the case that we were mentioning, we gave quite a number of examples in the paper. One key example is trade finance, where international exporter is shipping something, let's say red wine, to an importer. Right. The payer doesn't want to pay before receiving the goods. The sender doesn't want to ship before receiving the payment.
Sure.
So traditionally, it's very inefficient. Now, here is where smart contracting on blockchain could be useful by automating some transactions or transfers of value as soon as the contingency are achieved. So that's on the positive side. But going back to this negative side, what happens is, when two sellers or two exporters in competition, when they act as record keepers or verifiers in a blockchain system, they get to see more information than they usually observe. And when they don't see customers coming, typically in a traditional economy, they may not know that's because my rival has lowered the price. That's why he or she gets all the customers, or because there is just no customer in that particular week.
Right.
So in that sense, they cannot effectively maintain a collusion of charging a higher price, because typically to maintain that collusion, what they do is they need to figure out if their rivals have deviated from that collusive behavior by charging a lower price. If they can perfectly observe that, they can perfectly punish their rivals by charging very competitive price, right? They go to a price war, and that's bad for both parties. But they can kind of punish any deviations from collusion. That wasn't feasible in traditional systems without being able to accurately observe whether my rivals or colluding parties has deviated. Now, with blockchain, because of more information distribution, that leads to more information. I can better detect deviations from collusion and therefore better punish collusion. And overall, that leads to ex ante more collusive behavior in the economy.
You know,
so,
oh, go ahead, finish your thought. I was just
I just want to kind of distill this information distribution trade-off a little bit and bring on a kind of a bigger picture.
Okay,
that's just one aspect of centralization versus decentralization. Another aspect people that have often talked about is actually energy consumption. If I want to duplicate records, right, in a distributed system, I have to do a lot of duplicate effort provision, and that's costly for energy. The Bitcoin mining industry annually consumes more than 60 terawatts hour energy. That's about the same as what Switzerland as a country consumes in a year. So that could be costly in terms of energy perspective.
Right, certainly.
There are also risk-sharing motives when the miners mine the blocks. They face risky payoffs. So just like insurance companies, they might want to form pools, mining pools, and that's what we observe. In 2012 or 13, the largest mining pools have reached over 50% of the global mining power. And that's a problem, again, because that goes against the decentralization idea. And actually, in another study, my co-authors and I look at the formation of mining pools and actually point out that concern is actually not that big a deal, because the industrial organization and the fees mining pool owners charge will naturally prevent over-concentration. What should worry us more in that setting, or what is more detrimental to the society, is the way miners compete for recording these blocks. They are using a lot of energy. It's an arms race. It doesn't produce any social goods. And forming mining pools would only lead them to take more computation power to join this tournament for recording the next block.
Right.
And that's socially wasteful. And that's something we should worry about. It ties back to the energy kind of consumption.
Well, one of the things that kind of jumps out at me when I first started looking at this, when you were talking about mining pools, and one of the things that raised my interest was the fact that a country could decide to become a miner in and of itself, and then
right.
and then would that raise any questions for you as an economist that they may try to influence what's happening in that space?
Yes. China and Russia are key examples. China, not anymore, because the government has banned kind of Bitcoin mining,
right,
and trading.
I was thinking
those
about
are
like North Korea, as an example.
Korea as well. Those are big issues, but may not be as severe in the sense that because the mining activity is open to potential entry, right? Other countries can join as well, and they can compete. Right. It doesn't mean one country is joining necessarily leads to that country is dominating.
Right.
But the key cause is really when everyone joins and spend more power there, they're not producing any real goods.
Yes.
It's just a tournament. So that's wasteful. And that's something we should be concerned with. And that doesn't have to be that way. There are alternative protocols for generating decentralized consensus that could save on that energy waste. Well,
one of the things that does jump out at me is, and you mentioned this in when we're walking through collusion, right? Is that you said the ability of other people within the block to see what people are doing and then to punish the people that are not participating in the collusive activity, I guess. It really reminds me of a real world example that we have out there, which is OPEC. So my guess would be OPEC would probably be pretty interested in putting things on a block so that they could actually have better information about what their members are doing.
Right, exactly. I think that's a great application. We should mention that in the paper.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, if you mention it, then you just a little footnote just says Andy Bush.
Yes, I need to acknowledge your contribution there. And that's actually a great example. And that also leads to kind of regulation, right? Whether other countries outside OPEC would want to come monitor their collusive behavior, so on and so forth. And in the paper, we do make some suggestions as well on how regulators can potentially deal with the problem.
Well, walk us through that, because I think that's important. Because I from a regulatory standpoint, what should people be thinking about, or what solutions do you offer to solve the collusion problem?
Right. So unfortunately, we don't offer a perfect solution, but those are some initial steps towards solving the problem. One is just the regulators have to be on top of the latest development of the technology. They could have a node in the blockchain ecosystem that allows them to observe at least as much information as the participants in that environment. And we also suggested that separating the users of a blockchain system from its consensus providers could be helpful, because even though the providers get to observe the information, if they are not the users of the blockchain system, they cannot collude using their additional information. So those are some suggestions worth exploring, but it doesn't perfectly solve the problem, in the sense that a lot of the time, the best verifiers of certain transactions are the users themselves. So it may not allow us to perfectly separate them, but at least that's worth examining from a regulatory point of view.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like there's a need for a lot more study on this topic. And I guess for me, like, what are you going to be doing, Will? I mean, what are the next areas for your research?
That's a great question, and a question that's challenging to many researchers. What's the next topic?
Your boss probably wants to know the same question, answer the same question. What are you doing? What's coming next?
Right. Fortunately, this is a new area, a new development, and there are many interesting questions. So what I've touched on just now is more on how we maintain the system, the consensus provision, the functional trust system. It's a little bit on the supply side of the functional trust system. There's a lot to explore on the demand side as well, which is to take the functionalities of the blockchain technology or certain platforms as given and see how it affects traditional industries and business practices. One example is financial reporting. How does blockchain change auditing services, auditing pricing, misreporting, so on and so forth? How does it change the growth of a social network or a platform where there is network effect, meaning the more people join the network, the better, the more benefit I derive as a participant there. Or how we can use blockchains and tokens to finance startups. Besides fraudulent activities, is there real economic insights and innovation in financing startups using tokens? And that's something I'm currently working on with my co-authors, Ye Li from Ohio State University and Ning Wang from Columbia Business School, to figure out how does tokens substitute the roles of traditional contracts in a sharing economy where there's a lot of on-demand labor, where you cannot contract with each one, and they come work for an hour, then they switch to another job. should we use a more standardized money-like kind of contracts or assets to kind of mediate and incentivize contributions in that environment? That's something I'm currently looking into. So it's a little bit more on the applications of the technology.
Fantastic. That's our show for this week. That ends part 1 of our 2-part series with Professor Will Cong. Remember, you can get access to all the shows we do here by either going to our website at cftc.gov or by getting out your phone and clicking on the podcast app and typing in CFTC Talks. And click subscribe if you want to get them every week. I'm Andy Bush, Chief Market Intelligence Officer for the CFTC. Thanks for listening. This has been CFTC Talks. But wait, we're not done yet. It's time for a disclaimer. The CFTC is providing this information as a public service, and it is neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of CFTC policy. Reference to any specific product, service, trademark, manufacturer, or service provider does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the CFTC. The CFTC is not liable to any consumer or any third party for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, special, or exemplary damages or lost profit related to the use of the information provided or referenced in this podcast. Selection of guests on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of any particular individual or entity. Many individuals and entities provide similar services to those of the guests. The views and opinions expressed by the guests in the podcast are their own and not specifically endorsed by the CFTC. Moreover, the information provided in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Consumers should rely on their own inquiries as to accuracy and relevance of the information incorporated or referenced in this podcast and assume the entire risk related to its use. The CFTC is providing its interpretation of market trends solely to inform the public of a framework for projecting possible outcomes under different scenarios. If you have any questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular law or rule administered by the CFTC, please consult an attorney.